The moment I stepped out onto my back porch and caught the smell, I knew something was wrong. Not just wrong, catastrophic. The air hit me like a punch in the gut. Rotting eggs, sewage, maybe even death itself. I followed the stench to the edge of my yard, and my stomach turned. There was raw sewage bubbling up from the ground, gray sludge oozing through the grass like a festering wound. My boots sank into it when I stepped forward, and it squelched like a wet sponge. The worst part? The drain cover was wide open, and a fresh PVC pipe, clearly not mine, snaked from my HOA president's yard straight into my property. I stared at it in disbelief. You've got to be kidding me. That's when I heard it. The familiar click-click of kitten heels on concrete. I turned. There she was, standing at the edge of her pristine white fence, holding a clipboard like it was a badge. Veronica Ramsey. 60-something, always in pearls, always squinting like the sun personally offended her. President of the Wisteria Lakes HOA for 12 years, and a certified nightmare. "Oh, Patrick," she said, voice as sweet as vinegar. "I see you've discovered the drainage issue." "Drainage issue? You mean the sewage pipe you buried under my fence?" She waved a hand like I was being dramatic. "Let's not be petty. The HOA had to reroute the overflow system. You know, for the greater good. Your yard was the only logical runoff point." I stared at her, blinking. "You dumped the neighborhood's sewage into my yard." She sniffed. "It's just gray water, dear. You should be honored. You're contributing to community sanitation." I clenched my fists. "You didn't get my permission." "Oh, the board approved it." "Unanimously." She smiled with all the warmth of a tax audit. "It's all in the bylaws. Section 38, Paragraph 4, Easement Conditions for Emergency Overflow Solutions. You should really read the handbook." "You wrote the handbook. And you signed when you bought the house," she chirped. I didn't trust myself to speak. I turned and walked back inside, boots covered in muck, jaw clenched so tight I thought my molars might crack. She just stood there, scribbling something on her clipboard. That night, I didn't sleep. I researched. I dug through every public record, city ordinance, and plumbing regulation I could get my hands on. My desk was buried in printed documents. I found the original easement maps. Nothing gave her the right to reroute waste onto my land. But she'd buried the new pipe deep, and the HOA's contractor had backdated the permits. I was furious, and I was going to fix it. But I wasn't just going to dig up her pipe. No, that would be too easy, too reversible. I was going to make sure she remembered why you don't mess with a man who spent 15 years in civil engineering before he retired. The next morning, I called in a few old favors. I knew a guy who worked with rapid drying concrete stuff used for emergency bridge repairs. Expensive, but effective. I told him I was patching a sinkhole. He dropped off the materials by noon. I scoped out her house. She was gone HOA meeting, no doubt, where she'd spent 2 hours complaining about mailbox heights and non-regulation garden gnomes. I'd seen her basement access hatch before, hidden behind her trellises. I knew it led right under her sunroom. And I knew she left it unlocked. She didn't believe in city crime. I put on gloves, wheeled the mixer over, and got to work. I didn't fill the whole basement, just enough to make a point. 6 inches of concrete, leveled and smooth, right across the floor. Covered the drain, the water heater base, and her precious antique wine rack. By the time she got home, it would be too late. That evening, I sat on my porch sipping lemonade, watching the sun dip below the trees. Then I heard it a scream, sharp and high-pitched, followed by the sound of heavy heels crashing down wooden steps. "Patrick," she shrieked. I turned slowly, like I hadn't been waiting all day for this. "Evening, Veronica." Her face was redder than a stop sign. You vandalized my home." "Vandalized?" I raised an eyebrow, holding up a copy of the county's flood mitigation guidelines. "I was just improving drainage. You know, for the greater good." She stomped over, fist clenched. "You filled my basement with concrete." I shrugged. "It's just rapid set mix. You should be honored. You're contributing to community safety." "I'm calling the police." "Fantastic. I already have a report ready for them, including photos of your illegal sewage pipe, the backdated permits, and the resulting damage to my property." She sputtered. You won't get away with this." "Neither will you." Right on cue, the city inspector's truck pulled up. I'd filed a complaint the day before with the Municipal Environmental Office. The guy stepped out, clipboard in hand, hard hat under his arm. He looked from her to me, then down at the sludge still seeping into my yard. "Ma'am, he called. We need to talk about that unauthorized waste disposal system. Her face fell. They were still talking when the second car arrived. Code enforcement. The HOA might have owned the rules, but the city owned the law. And as it turned out, rerouting sewage without a licensed plumber or city permit wasn't just a violation, it was a misdemeanor. Veronica tried to argue, of course. Claimed it was a community project. Blamed the HOA board. But the inspector wasn't having it. Ma'am, I've already looked at the records, he said. You signed off on this personally. You're the acting president. You're liable. She went pale. I watched them take statements, snap photos, and measure the runoff damage. A few neighbors started to gather, whispering, pointing. I could almost hear the shift in the wind. Veronica Ramsey, untouchable queen of the cul-de-sac, was finally exposed. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The HOA had made my property a dumping ground. Now it was time to return the favor. One clause at a time. The next morning, I found a note taped to my mailbox. It was typed in bold, block letters like some legal cease and desist, except it was printed on pink paper with a floral border. Classic Veronica. The note accused me of malicious sabotage, demanded restoration of structural integrity, and threatened immediate HOA disciplinary action. I tossed it in the compost bin without a second glance. I wasn't worried. I had already filed a formal complaint with the Environmental Enforcement Division. The kind of complaint that triggers audits, inspections, and a paper trail thicker than a phone book. And while she was busy trying to control the narrative, I was 3 steps ahead. I'd spent most of the previous night submitting public records requests, pulling campaign donation receipts, and cross-referencing her name against contractor licenses. And wouldn't you know it, Veronica had personally approved over $30,000 in emergency landscaping expenses over the past year, all paid to a company based out of her sister-in-law's garage. No business license, no website, and no traceable work orders. Just invoices signed with her initials. I printed everything and mailed copies to the city comptroller, the state ethics board, and the district attorney's office. Then I sat back and waited. By noon, I had visitors. A silver SUV rolled up and parked half on the curb. Out stepped a man in a pressed gray suit, his tie a little too tight for the weather. He looked around, spotted the mess in my yard, then walked straight up my driveway like he owned the place. You Patrick Delaney? He asked, flipping open a leather badge holder. I nodded. You with the city? Internal fraud investigations. He tucked the badge away. Mind if I ask you a few questions? I waved him inside. We sat at my kitchen table while I pulled up the files on my laptop. He scrolled through them with the kind of intensity that said he'd seen worse. But not by much. This personal landscaping firm. You're sure it's connected to her family? Her sister-in-law. Same last name, same home address. I cross-checked utility accounts and voter registration. She's never filed a single tax return under that business name. He leaned back, rubbing his jaw. And the pipe installation? I handed him a folder. Here's the backdated permit. Signed by a contractor whose license expired 2 years ago. He stared at the paper. This is enough to open a formal investigation. Good. Because I'm not the only one she's stepped on. He looked up. Others. Half the neighborhood's afraid of her. She's fined people for wind chimes, for planting sunflowers, even for using the wrong shade of mulch. She rewrote the HOA handbook so many times no one even knows what the rules are anymore. He nodded slowly. We'll be in touch. After he left, I walked over to my neighbor's place. Mrs. Kim, retired librarian, lived alone with 2 cats and an herb garden she treated like royalty. Veronica once made her rip out her lavender bushes because they attracted bees. I figured if anyone would be ready to talk, it was her. She answered the door wearing gardening gloves and a visor. Patrick. Hey, Mrs. Kim. Got a minute? She waved me in. Her living room smelled like lemon oil and dried rosemary. I told her what happened, everything from the sewage pipe to the city inspector to the fraud file. Her reaction was immediate. That woman has been terrorizing this street for years. You remember the time she tried to ban porch swings? I didn't, but I nodded anyway. Well, she said, pulling open a drawer and rifling through it. I've kept every notice, every fine, every memo she ever sent me. I was going to shred them, but something told me I'd need them someday. She handed me a stack of folders, neatly labeled by year. I flipped through them, pages and pages of arbitrary fines, threats of lien filings, even a letter accusing her of unauthorized hummingbird feeders. This is gold, I said. I hope it buries her. I spent the rest of the day gathering more stories. Turns out, Veronica had once demanded a single dad repaint his door 3 times because she claimed the color lowered property values. She fined a veteran for flying a flag on a pole that was too tall and tried to evict a family that hosted a birthday party with unlicensed inflatables. But what really sealed her fate was the discovery made by Todd, the neighborhood's quietest resident. Todd worked in IT for a defense contractor and rarely came outside unless it was to walk his dog. Turns out, Todd had been running a private server that logged the traffic from the HOA's email account strictly for security, he claimed, after Veronica tried to accuse him of cyberbullying for posting a meme about her on a community Facebook group. What Todd had was a complete archive of every email she'd ever sent as HOA president, including one where she instructed her treasurer to shred the outdated water runoff plans and use the new ones unmarked. The others are too restrictive. I took the files, organized everything into a digital folder, and sent it to the fraud investigator, the city council, and a few reporters with a taste for HOA drama. 2 days later, it was like someone kicked a hornet's nest. The HOA meeting that Thursday was standing room only. People who hadn't shown up in years packed into the clubhouse, murmuring and whispering as Veronica stood near the podium, flanked by her ever-loyal treasurer, a man named Doug who always wore white socks with sandals and nodded too much. "I'd like to begin with a reminder," she said, tapping the microphone, "that disruptive behavior will not be tolerated." From the back, someone muttered, "Like illegal sewage rerouting?" She froze. "I have the floor," she snapped. "No, you don't," said Angela, a nurse from down the street who'd never raised her voice before. "You lost that when you flooded Patrick's yard and lied about it." Murmurs turned to grumbles. Someone knocked over a folding chair. "I have served this community for over a decade," Veronica said, voice tight. "And I will not be disrespected by." "You embezzled HOA funds," said Todd, holding up his tablet. "You authorized unlicensed construction, falsified permits, and you used our dues to pay your sister-in-law. We have the records. All of them." Doug tried to interrupt, but Angela raised her hand. "We're calling for a vote of no confidence. Right now." Veronica glared. "You can't just." "We can," said Mrs. Kim, stepping forward with a folder of her own. "According to Article 7, Section 4, any HOA official may be removed with a 2/3 vote from the membership during a special session. And I believe this qualifies." Hands shot up across the room. Veronica's face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions: shock, rage, disbelief, but no one moved to defend her. Even Doug looked like he wanted to disappear into his sandals. The vote was counted out loud. Over 70 hands in favor, 3 against, 2 abstained. Veronica stood motionless, her mouth slightly open. Angela stepped up to the podium. "Effective immediately, Veronica Ramsey is removed from all HOA leadership roles. We will be conducting a full audit. And going forward, all major decisions will be subject to community vote." The room erupted into applause. As I walked out into the cool night air, I saw Veronica standing by her car, keys clutched tight, staring at the clubhouse like it just betrayed her. She didn't say anything as I passed. Just got in, slammed the door, and peeled out like she was racing away from her own reputation. She didn't come back. Not the next day. Not the next week. And while the HOA began the slow process of cleaning up her mess, my yard finally dried out. The city sent a crew to remove the illegal pipe, and the environmental office cited the HOA for multiple violations, all of which were now Veronica's personal responsibility. As for her basement, well, concrete cures fast and lasts longer than memories. And every time I walked by that sunroom, I smiled. Not because I'd won, but because she'd finally lost. The following Saturday, after the dust settled and Veronica's name was scrubbed from every sign, email, and bulletin board in Wisteria Lakes, I found myself standing in my garage with a push broom and a stack of unopened mail. Life had returned to something resembling normal. The air no longer smelled like decay, and the grass in my backyard was finally starting to come back, though the bare patches still looked like a bad haircut. I was mid-sweep when I heard the unmistakable sound of a U-Haul backing up. I stepped out to the driveway. Sure enough, a moving truck was parked in front of Veronica's house. 2 men in tank tops and cargo shorts were struggling with a large dresser. I watched as they maneuvered it through the front door, nearly clipping the trim. I crossed over without thinking. "Someone finally buying the place?" I asked, nodding toward the truck. The taller of the two guys wiped his forehead with a rag. Nah, just clearing it out. Bank's taking it back. Foreclosure notice went up this morning. It took me a second to process that. She didn't even try to sell it? He shrugged. Didn't seem like it. House is a mess inside. Water damage, mold, busted foundation. Place smells like cat pee and lemon cleaner. I walked away slowly. Foreclosure. I hadn't expected that. I figured she'd slink off somewhere, maybe to her sister-in-law's place, or move in with a friend from her bridge club. But to just vanish and let the bank claim it? That was abrupt. By Monday, the gossip had taken over every porch and mailbox bench in the neighborhood. Nobody had seen Veronica since the night of the vote. Someone swore they saw her get into a black sedan at dawn, suitcase in hand. Another neighbor claimed she left a note on her fridge that just said, "Do what you want." I didn't care about the rumors. What mattered was what came next. Angela had taken over as interim president, and she wasted no time. She called for an open forum in the clubhouse to discuss changes. For the first time in years, people actually showed up willingly. Not out of fear of fines, but out of curiosity. The place looked different already. Gone were Veronica's fake ferns and framed community standards quotes. Instead, folding tables held coffee urns and donut boxes. A whiteboard stood at the front, markers already squeaking as Angela wrote out bullet points. "We're rebuilding the way this HOA works," she said, turning to face the room. "And we're doing it together." People clapped, but it was cautious, hesitant. After years of being shut down and talked over, most of them didn't know how to participate without fear of retaliation. Angela pointed to me. "Patrick, you had a proposal?" I stood up, cleared my throat. "Yeah, two actually. First, we amend the bylaws to require a full member vote for any use of HOA funds over $2,000. No more backroom spending. Secondly, we establish a rotating oversight committee, 5 residents who aren't on the board, who can audit books anytime." There were murmurs, but this time they weren't suspicious. They were impressed. Mrs. Kim raised a hand. "Can we add a stipulation that meetings be recorded and archived? Just so there's always a record." Angela smiled. "Absolutely." Over the next 2 hours, the community transformed. People who'd been silenced for years began speaking up. A high school art teacher suggested painting murals on the utility boxes. A retired electrician offered to fix the busted clubhouse lights for free. Ideas spilled out, one after another. As the meeting ended, Angela pulled me aside. "You ever think about joining the board?" she asked. I laughed. "I just poured concrete into someone's basement. You also prevented a health hazard and dismantled a dictatorship. We could use you." I shook my head. "I'd rather stay the guy with the broom and the extra floodlights. Keeps me grounded." She nodded. "Suit yourself. But if you change your mind, let me know." The weeks passed. Grass sprouted where the sludge had been. The city sent a landscaping crew to regrade the yard at no cost, part of a settlement agreement after the environmental citations. The HOA, now under new management, reimbursed me for the damages Veronica had caused. The funds came from an emergency reserve they discovered buried in an account she'd never mentioned. Not surprising, considering the balance was over $28,000. One afternoon, Todd showed up at my door holding a manila envelope. "Got something you'll want to see," he said. I let him in, and we sat at the dining table where I'd once spread out blueprints and fraud reports. "She emailed the board the night after she lost the vote," he said, sliding the envelope over. "Doug tried to delete it. I recovered it. Inside was a single printed page. The subject line, 'If I go down, I'm taking them with me.' The message itself was short. No greetings, no signature. Just a list of names, residents, contractors, even a former HOA treasurer from 5 years back. Next to each name, a dollar amount or a short phrase. Late landscaping payment, unlicensed dog, cash bonus, gift card, Home Depot." She was building a blackmail file, Todd said. Probably to use if anyone turned on her. I stared at the page. Some of the people listed were still on the street. Others had moved. A few, like Mrs. Kim, had clearly been targets for years. "I already gave a copy to the auditor," Todd said. "But you should know Angela's name isn't on it. Neither is yours." That didn't surprise me. We weren't useful leverage. We were threats. I folded the page and tucked it away. "Thanks for this." Todd stood. "No problem. I figure if she ever tries to come back, we'll be ready. Let's hope she doesn't." But even as I said it, I knew better. People like Veronica didn't disappear. They regrouped. 2 months later, I got confirmation. I was at the hardware store picking up some drainage rock when I spotted a familiar haircut 2 aisles over. Rigid bob, platinum blonde, stiff as fiberglass insulation. She was talking to a man in khakis and a tucked-in polo. I ducked behind a shelf of PVC elbows and watched. She was gesturing toward a clipboard, pointing to a brochure about vinyl fencing. My phone buzzed. A message from Angela. Did you hear? Lakeside Villas just elected a new HOA president. Guess who? I didn't reply. I already knew. Veronica had resurfaced in a neighborhood 12 miles away. New board, new bylaws, same tactics. She'd landed on her feet, just like people like her always did. But this time, I wasn't angry. I was prepared. I spent the next few weeks compiling everything we uncovered: fraud, misuse of funds, falsified permits, and that list Todd recovered. I organized it into a single document, added links to the city reports, and saved it as a PDF titled, For Future Reference. Then I created an anonymous email account and sent it to every resident in Lakeside Villas. I didn't include a message. I didn't need to. I figured they'd recognize the smell soon enough. 2 weeks after I sent that anonymous email to every homeowner in Lakeside Villas, my phone rang while I was elbow deep in my garage, trying to fix a cracked wheel on my yard cart. I didn't recognize the number, but something made me wipe my hands on an old towel and answer it anyway. The voice on the other end was sharp, deliberate, and full of that practiced calm people use right before they drop a hammer. This is Officer Marla Baird with the County Fraud Division. I was given your number by Mr. Todd Wilkins. He said you were the one who compiled the HOA complaint against Veronica Ramsey. I straightened up. That's right. Is this about Lakeside Villas? There was a pause. Yes. We'd like to meet with you. Preferably in person. I agreed to meet her at the municipal building downtown, tucked behind the courthouse in a squat, beige building that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the early 90s. Inside, Officer Baird met me in a small room with scuffed tile floors and a whiteboard covered in faded marker residue. She had the kind of presence that made you sit straighter without realizing it. Her badge clipped to her belt, not her chest, and a manila folder thick with documents resting in front of her. We've been watching Ms. Ramsey for a while, she said, flipping open the folder. But until your file landed in our inbox, we didn't have enough to pursue anything beyond minor code enforcement. That's changed. She slid a glossy photo toward me. It showed a driveway cracked and discolored leading up to a small stucco house with a tidy lawn. What drew my eye was the suspiciously familiar PVC pipe running along the side of the house. She tried the same trick again, I said. She did, Baird confirmed. Only this time, the homeowner was elderly. Didn't realize what was happening until their backyard started pooling with wastewater. I leaned forward. She's escalating. We're getting sloppy, Baird said, flipping to another page. The residents at Lakeside Villas are scared. She's already issued over 70 violation notices in 8 days. She fined a man $200 for having a yellow umbrella. Another woman was told to remove her wheelchair ramp because it interfered with visual consistency. She's trying to re-establish control fast, I said, before anyone gets organized. Baird nodded. We've already opened a formal investigation, but we're limited. HOAs are technically private organizations. Unless someone inside the board cooperates, we're stuck chasing violations and bad press. I took a breath. What do you need from me? Her eyes met mine. Your strategy. You dismantled her power structure once. We want to see if you can do it again this time from the outside. I didn't answer right away. The thought of diving back into another neighborhood's nightmare wasn't appealing. But then I remembered the look on Mrs. Kim's face when she handed me those folders. How defeated she looked before we stood up together. I gave a slow nod. Fine, but I won't go in blind. I need names, a copy of their bylaws, and access to their board minutes. Baird grinned for the first time. Already printed and waiting. I took the documents home, spread them across my dining table, and started reading. Lakeside Villas had a different structure than Wisteria Lakes. Smaller, only 24 homes, but with stricter guidelines. Their bylaws were 80 pages long, most of it dense legalese that screamed Veronica's influence. The signatures on the last revision were all dated 3 days after her election. That meant she'd rewritten the rules before even attending her first board meeting. But the real kicker was the clause buried on page 69, Emergency Executive Authority. It gave the HOA president unilateral control in cases of immediate neighborhood risk, which included everything from weather damage to aesthetic disruptions. That clause made her untouchable unless the residents voted to repeal it. And to do that, they needed a 3/4 majority. I spent the next week reaching out to residents. Carefully, quietly, I used burner emails, made calls from a prepaid phone, and left anonymous flyers in mailboxes. I directed them to a website I built overnight, restorelakeside.org. It had everything: the sewage photos, the fund misuse evidence, even audio clips Todd had pulled from archived meetings. And it worked. By the end of the week, I had 13 of the 24 households signed onto a petition, enough to trigger a special meeting under their own bylaws. They just didn't know how to make it official. That's where Angela came in. She met me at a diner just off the highway, her nurse scrubs still on under a windbreaker. "You're sure this will work?" she asked, stirring her coffee. "She's using the same playbook," I said. "We just have to flip the board before she locks them down with loyalty fines or legal threats." Angela reached into her bag and pulled out a motion template, something our new HOA had adopted after the purge. It included sample language for repealing executive privileges. "This should give them a foothold," she said. "But they'll need someone to present it." "I've got someone," I said. "Her name's Marissa. She's a school counselor who lives across from Veronica. She's already gotten 2 fines, one for wind chimes, the other for a welcome mat with a non-neutral pattern." Angela blinked. "That's a new low." "She's ready to speak," I said. "But she's scared. Veronica's already threatened to file a lien if she doesn't remove her backyard trellis." Angela leaned back. "Then we're out of time." The special meeting was held on a Wednesday night. I didn't attend, not directly. I sat in my truck, parked just outside the neighborhood, scanner tuned to the open frequency Todd had rigged from their clubhouse PA system. I listened as residents filed in, murmuring, chairs scraping. Then Marissa's voice rang out, shaky at first, then stronger. She read from the motion, called for a repeal of the emergency clause, cited exact violations, listed the fines, the threats, the sewage incident. Then she paused. For a moment, all I heard was the buzz of the old speakers. Then another voice, an older man, probably one of the original homeowners, stood up and seconded the motion. The vote was called. 17 in favor, 5 against, 2 abstained. Veronica's voice came through next. I could practically hear the tremble behind her words as she declared the motion invalid, claimed the petition was forged, said the meeting wasn't sanctioned. But no one listened. The board voted immediately after to suspend her presidency pending a full audit. And just like that, she was out. Again. I sat back in my seat and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The next morning, I woke to a photo from Marissa. It showed Veronica's house quiet, no car in the driveway. The porch lights were off. According to the timestamp, it was taken just before sunrise. She was gone. I didn't expect gratitude. I didn't need it. But that afternoon, a cardboard box showed up on my porch. No note. Inside were 2 things, a bottle of scotch and a handmade sign that read, "No sewage, no tyrants, just neighbors." I nailed it to the inside of my garage. Weeks passed. Wisteria Lakes continued to thrive under real leadership. Lakeside villas followed suit, adopting transparent policies, cutting unnecessary fines, and even organizing their first block party in years. Veronica's name faded from the newsletters. Her house in Lakeside sat vacant for a while, then sold quietly through a third-party agency. I heard she moved north, maybe to a gated community where no one knew her name. But I doubted she'd change. One morning in early spring, I got a package with no return address. Inside was a single copy of a neighborhood newsletter. Different town, different HOA. But on the second page, under board announcements, was a familiar name. Interim President, Veronica Ramsey. I stared at it for a long time. Then I picked up my phone, opened a new document, and started typing again. Because some people never learn. But some of us never forget.